The picture that won't leave me alone is a jacket, black and limp, hanging from a low pine branch in a photograph the detective slid across my kitchen table. The light in that image is thin and gray, the kind of mountain daylight that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The fabric is matted with needles and dust, the sleeves drooping like tired arms, and behind it the forest floor is a tangle of dead leaves and moss the color of old bruises. You can almost feel the chill in the air just by looking at it, that high country cold that settles into your teeth and the back of your neck. There's no face in the frame, no footprints, no obvious story, just that jacket alone, as if the person inside it had quietly dissolved into the trees. When I saw the picture for the first time, I could hear my own refrigerator humming and the faint tick of the baseboard heater, while the world in that photo stayed utterly still. The detective said nothing at first. He didn't need to. I recognized the jacket before he told me whose it was. Even now, when I shut my eyes at night, I can feel the roughness of that glossy paper against my fingertips, and the way the pine shadows on the page seemed darker than they should have been. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from, and follow if you believe some names should never fade. My name is Linda, and I've spent most of my life on the same two-lane road that snakes out of Stowe and into the hills, the kind of road where the mailboxes lean a little and the ditches run with snowmelt half the year. In April of 2021, when all of this began, the world here smelled like thawing earth and wet bark, that particular Vermont mud season perfume you either learn to love or you move away from. I had the cabin. I had my little house up the hill, and between the two, I had a life that was predictable in the best possible way. Mornings started with the grind of coffee beans and the soft hiss of the kettle. The view out my kitchen window, still mostly brown and gray patches of snow clinging to the shadows where the sun couldn't quite reach. If a car passed before 7, I could usually guess who it was by the sound of the tires on the gravel and the way they took the curve. Running the cabin had become second nature by then. I'd bought the A-frame years earlier when it was still a drafty relic from the 1960s with orange shag carpeting and mouse nests in the walls. I spent 2 summers tearing it apart with my brother's help sanding beams until my arms shook and breathing in the sharp, sweet smell of fresh-cut pine as new boards went up. By the time I listed it online, the place had tall windows that caught the morning light, a small but clean kitchenette, and a wood stove that gave off that dry, smoky warmth you feel most in your hands and feet. Guests loved it. They called it cozy and peaceful and perfect for a reset, leaving me notes on the little notepad by the door, the paper always faintly scented with wood smoke and the lemon oil I used on the counters. Most weekends followed the same rhythm. By late Friday afternoon, I'd hear the crunch of tires on the cabin's gravel drive and see headlights thread through the pines. Couples from Boston, old friends from New York, the occasional solo traveler. People arrived with coolers and backpacks, voices echoing up the slope to my house when the air was still. I'd walk down with a light jacket against the lingering chill, the smell of damp leaves underfoot, and do my little orientation speech. Show them how to work the lock where the extra blankets were, how to jiggle the stove's damper just right so it wouldn't smoke up the place. Then I'd leave them be, let the forest and the silence do the rest. By Monday at 11, the cars would be gone. The beds unmade, but the dishes rinsed, and I'd step into that familiar quiet of an empty cabin, sunlight slanting across the floorboards and catching dust in the air. It wasn't glamorous, but it gave me enough money to breathe a little easier. I kept books for a local mechanic shop 3 days a week, numbers and invoices and greasy paper under my fingernails, and the cabin covered the gaps. Nights were slow and simple, a glass of red wine, the low hum of the old refrigerator, maybe the distant sound of a dog barking down the valley if I cracked the kitchen window. Spring that year felt hopeful in a muted way. The worst of the pandemic fear had started to lift, though people still carried sanitizer in their pockets and wore masks into the general store. I noticed more solo bookings than usual, that March and April folks just wanting to be alone with their thoughts, I guessed, and I tried not to pry. You can hear loneliness in someone's voice even over text. but I'd learned that most guests didn't want their host to acknowledge it. I first heard from him in the dull light of a Tuesday afternoon, sitting at my kitchen table with a stack of receipts and the smell of strong coffee in the air. A new booking request slid into my phone with that little chime I'd come to recognize, and when I opened it, I saw a name I didn't know, Aaron Blake, and a simple message. He was looking for a week in mid-April, arriving on a Friday, checking out the following Friday, traveling alone. He asked politely if the cabin was quiet and if there were good hiking trails within a short drive. "I'll be working on some personal things," he wrote, "and I'd like to be away from the city for a bit." There was nothing strange in the words themselves, but something about the way he phrased it felt a little heavier than the usual need a break that people typed without thinking. I messaged him back with my usual thoroughness, my fingers moving over the screen while my other hand absently traced a ring of condensation on the table from my coffee mug. I told him about the long trail system, about the Sunset Ridge loop that climbed steady but not too steep, about the pockets of the forest where cell service vanished, and all you had was the sound of your own breathing and the wind in the firs. I reminded him there was no television, just Wi-Fi and the wood stove, and that this time of year the nights could still be sharp enough to make your ears sting if you stepped outside without a hat. He replied quickly, saying that sounded perfect and thanking me for the recommendations. The reservation went through with a soft little buzz from my phone, another name on the calendar for a week that would have otherwise been empty. In the days leading up to his arrival, the weather seesawed the way it always does here in April. One morning I woke up to fat, wet snowflakes sliding down the kitchen window. The world outside turned briefly white and muffled, the only sound the creak of tree branches under the weight. By mid-afternoon, the snow had melted into slush, and a dirty fog rose from the fields carrying the smell of cold mud and wet hay. I walked down to the cabin one of those afternoons with a broom in my gloved hand, brushing winter grit off the front steps, the wooden boards damp under the bristles. Inside, the air was faintly chilly and stale, so I cracked a window and let in a little of that raw spring wind while I changed the sheets and smoothed the quilt with practiced palms. I checked the flashlight batteries, straightened the row of trail brochures on the counter, and lined up the small amenities on the bathroom sink, hotel-sized soap-fresh washcloths folded just so. Sometimes when I prepared for guests, I caught myself imagining them building a picture from the names and profile photos that flashed across my phone. With Aaron, the platform showed a small square photo that was almost comically neutral. A man in his mid-30s. Dark hair, glasses, a faint shadow of stubble standing in front of what looked like an office wall. No dog in the frame, no beach, no group of laughing friends. Just him looking straight at the camera with an expression that could have been concentration or discomfort. It was hard to tell. As I tucked in the corners of the top sheet that day, I wondered what he'd be like in person. Quiet, I suspected maybe the type who said thank you too many times because he didn't know what else to do with his hands. The Friday he was due to arrive, the sky settled into a dull pewter color that made the late afternoon feel later than it really was. I finished up at the mechanic's office around 3 hands, smelling faintly of printer ink and motor oil, and drove the short distance home with the radio low, the heater blowing lukewarm air onto my ankles. A line of damp, dark clouds clung to the ridge beyond town, and the tops of the pines were lost in a hazy curtain of mist. When I pulled into my driveway, I could hear faint in the distance the crunch of another car's tires making the turn onto the cabin's gravel lane below. It's funny how you get to know a sound like that. Even from my kitchen window, I could tell it was a compact SUV by the higher pitch of the engine and the way it rolled over the stones. I shrugged into my jacket, feeling the cold zipper against my wrist, and walked down the hill through the trees. The ground was soft, my boots sinking just a little into the thawed earth, the air carrying that damp, metallic smell that comes when the last patches of snow surrender. As I stepped out of the trees, I saw the silver crossover parked nose first toward the cabin, its hood spattered with dried highway grime and a thin spray of mud. A man was standing by the driver's side door, stretching his back the way people do after a long drive, his breath a faint ghost in the April air. I called out a hello, and he turned toward me with a small, cautious smile, his shoulders tight inside a black fleece jacket that had a few stray pine needles already clinging to the sleeves. In person, Aaron was exactly and not at all what I had expected. He was taller than his profile photo suggested, maybe 5'10" or 5'11", with that slightly hunched posture you see in people who spend too many hours at a computer. His glasses fogged for a second when he exhaled, then cleared, and when he offered his hand, his grip was firm but not overly eager. His voice, when he said my name, was soft and even, with the faintest hint of Boston in certain vowels. Up close, I could see the fine creases at the corners of his eyes, the kind that come more from squinting at screens than from laughing in the sun. There was nothing overtly sad about him, but there was a kind of inwardness, like he was carrying a backpack you couldn't see. I walked him through the usual routine, the front door creaking just a little as I pushed it open, releasing a cool rush of air that smelled of wood dust and the faint trace of the last guest's coffee grounds still in the trash. I showed him the wood stove, tapping the iron door with my knuckles so he could hear the hollow ring, and pointed out the basket of kindling I'd stacked that morning, each piece dry and splintered resin sticking faintly to my fingers when I'd handled it. He listened closely, nodding at all the right moments, his eyes tracking the latch on the window, the circuit breaker box at the back, the fire extinguisher by the door. When I mentioned the Wi-Fi password, his gaze flicked toward the small router plugged into the wall, then back to me, and he gave a short, appreciative little laugh when I warned him that up here, high speed was more a suggestion than a promise. We talked briefly about trails standing by the big front window while the light outside shifted toward evening, the tree trunks turning darker against the pale sky. I pointed to a laminated map I kept on a hook near the door and traced the route to the Sunset Ridge trailhead with the tip of my finger, the plastic cool and smooth under my skin. He leaned in a little, hands on his hips, his jacket brushing the edge of the counter, and asked about mileage and elevation in that careful, methodical way that told me he liked to plan more than improvise. I told him it was about 6 miles round trip steady, but not punishing, with a good payoff view if the sky cooperated. When I mentioned that the higher sections sometimes lost cell reception, he just nodded and said quietly, "That's kind of what I'm after." There was a pause after he said it. A small space where the only sound was the faint hum from the refrigerator and the whisper of wind outside moving through the bare branches. Back then, I didn't think much of it. Lots of people said they wanted to disconnect to get away from the noise, and most of them meant it in the flimsy way you mean it when you're still checking email from a hot tub. But something about the way Aaron's eyes stayed on the map instead of on me, the way his jaw tightened as he spoke, left a little ripple in the air between us. I remember the light on his face in that moment, soft and flat from the overcast sky outside, making him look slightly washed out, like a picture that's been left in a window too long. After I handed him the key and reminded him about checkout time the following Friday, I stepped back onto the porch, the cool wooden boards solid under my boots. The air had cooled enough that I could see a stronger puff of my own breath when I exhaled, and somewhere up the hill a crow called out its harsh voice, cutting through the quiet. He thanked me again, twice, actually standing in the doorway with one hand on the frame, the warm cabin air at his back and the chill evening pressing in from outside. I walked back up my path through the trees, listening to the crunch of my steps and the faint sound of his car door closing behind me, thinking no more of it than I would of any other guest beginning their week. That night, from my own kitchen, the cabin's windows were just a soft rectangle of yellow down the slope, floating between the dark trunks like a lantern hung low. I washed dishes with the radio murmuring in the background and glanced out now and then, catching the shadow of someone moving past the glass. At one point, after I'd dried my hands on a towel that still smelled faintly of laundry soap and smoke, my phone buzzed with a motion alert from the camera above the cabin's front door. I glanced at the thumbnail without really seeing it, just a blur of gray and black in the dim light, and set the phone back down, telling myself I could always check the clip later if I needed to. By the time I went to bed, a thin rain had started tapping softly at my bedroom window, the sound steady and comforting like fingers drumming on a table. I lay there listening to it, the house around me settling in little pops and creaks as the temperature dropped, thinking vaguely about tomorrow's errands and whether the dirt road would still be passable if the rain turned the ruts to soup. The cabin's light was no longer visible through the trees either, because he'd closed the curtains or switched off the lamps, and the darkness down that slope felt ordinary to me then. Still, as I reached over to turn off my bedside lamp, I had the odd, fleeting sense that something on the property was just slightly out of rhythm, like a clock that's off by a few seconds, though I couldn't have told you why. I listened for the sound of a car engine starting down below and heard nothing but the rain. I didn't realize anything was wrong at first. That Saturday morning began like so many others up here in the early spring, thin gray light filtering through the bare branches, the air still holding the night's cold like a secret. I woke just before 7 to the soft tapping of rain on my bedroom window, the kind of steady, patient drizzle that makes the whole valley feel half asleep. I remember stretching under the blankets, listening to the house creak as it warmed, feeling no hint of what the day was about to become. I had no reason to look toward the cabin. I assumed my guest was inside making coffee or tying his boots, getting ready for a day in the hills. Nothing felt out of place. It wasn't until late morning, when the rain lifted and a pale sun began leaking through the clouds, that I caught myself glancing down the slope. The cabin's porch light was off, and no movement showed through the windows, perfectly normal for a quiet guest on a Saturday. Still, something tugged at me, a faint thread of curiosity I couldn't explain. I shrugged it off and went back to tidying the kitchen, rinsing the faint smell of last night's garlic from the sink. Around noon, I walked out to bring in the mail, the gravel soft beneath my boots, a mild breeze carrying the clean scent of wet pine. From the bend in my driveway, I could just see the silver crossover parked exactly as it had been the night before. I didn't think much about it until early afternoon, when I noticed the angle of the sun through my window and realized I hadn't heard a single sound from the cabin all day. No car engine, no door shutting, nothing. That's unusual out here. Even the quiet ones tend to step outside at least once to breathe the mountain air, to stretch their legs, to admire the view. I remember standing by my sink dish towel in hand, feeling the smallest stir of worry, like the flutter of a moth brushing the inside of my ribs. I told myself not to be dramatic. Adults take long naps. People read all morning. City folks like to disconnect. But the uneasiness clung to me. By late afternoon, the temperature dipped again. A thin fog drifted in from the ridge, settling low in the trees, and the whole property grew hushed as if the forest were holding its breath. I walked down to the cabin with the pretense of checking the gutters. The path was soft and quiet beneath me, the damp smell of soil rising in little pockets with each step. When I stepped out of the trees, the cabin looked perfectly calm, its dark roof slick with leftover moisture, the windows reflecting the cloudy sky. But something felt hollow. It was the stillness. Too still. Like the place was waiting for someone who hadn't arrived. I didn't knock then. I told myself he'd just stepped out without the car, maybe taking a long walk on a nearby back road. Maybe he'd found a trailhead on foot. Maybe he wanted fresh air and solitude. I turned back up the hill. But as the path curved, I remember glancing over my shoulder and seeing the cabin's curtains unmoved, the porch untouched. No tracks in the dirt, no fresh footprints near the steps, just the dense quiet of early evening settling around it. I fell asleep that night with an odd heaviness in my chest, though I didn't name it yet. Sometimes fear arrives long before the mind admits it. Sunday came colder. The sky a raw slab of steel. I woke early, made coffee, and walked to the window before I was fully aware I'd done it. The car was still there. Same spot, same angle. No fresh tire tracks. That was the first moment a cold pulse went through me, quick and sharp, like touching ice. Not panic, just the faintest recognition that something wasn't lining up. By mid-morning, the rain returned. Thin streaks pattered on the roof, carrying that earthy scent that rises after days of thaw. I waited until it eased, then headed down the hill again. This time I had no excuse, no broom, no chore. I just needed to see. I walked slowly, my jacket brushing against the wet spruce branches. When I reached the cabin, I stood still for a long moment listening. The air felt heavy, but not quite silent. There was the distant drip of melting snow, a crow somewhere up the ridge. Everything except the cabin felt alive. I knocked. A firm, deliberate knock, one I thought he'd hear even if he were showering or listening to music. No answer. I knocked again. The sound echoed through the still air and died quickly. Something inside me shifted then subtly but decisively. A small, steady ache of worry. I tried calling out his first name, my voice sounding too loud in the quiet. Still nothing. I told myself he might be on a long trail, that maybe he'd underestimated the time. Some people do. But a deeper instinct, the one that lives closer to the bones, was beginning to stir. I returned to my house with the kind of restless pacing I only notice when my nerves are starting to fray. All afternoon I kept glancing toward the trees, toward the faint outline of the cabin's roof. I'd see a bird land on a branch or the sway of a tall pine, and my heart would lift, hoping it was movement from the cabin. It never was. That night I barely slept. The wind picked up after sunset, rattling the old pane in my bedroom window, and the moon was shrouded in a thick, milky haze. I lay there listening to the gusts hissing through the trees, the house creaking in low protest. Around 2 in the morning, I got up, padded barefoot to the kitchen, and looked down the slope. The cabin was dark, completely dark. Not a single lamp. Not the faint glow of a phone screen. Not even the tiny red dot from the microwave's clock. Just darkness pooled beneath the trees. Monday morning arrived too early and too bright. The sun had come out with an almost careless cheerfulness, melting the last patches of snow in glittering streaks along the ditch. I stood at my kitchen counter with a cooling cup of coffee, staring at the spot between the trees where I knew the cabin sat. The longer I looked, the more deeply I felt that churn in my stomach. Something wasn't right. I put the mug down, grabbed my keys, and made my way down. As soon as I stepped onto the porch, the feeling sharpened like a cold needle pressing inward. The door was locked. That was normal. But the stillness wasn't. I knocked again. No answer. My hand hovered over the doorknob longer than it needed to. When I finally unlocked the door with my master key, a stale breath of air slipped out past me, a quiet mix of cooled wood smoke, old coffee, and the faint dampness of a space left untouched for too long. Inside, the soft morning light filtered through the tall windows in thin, dusty beams. The bed was unmade sheets, wrinkled like someone had slipped out of them in a hurry and never returned. A half-full coffee mug sat on the counter, faint rings forming along the rim. The suitcase lay open on the floor exactly where he'd placed it, Friday night clothes, folded with a kind of careful neatness that made the sight feel even more eerie. A toothbrush waited on the sink. A laptop sat closed on the desk untouched. His wallet rested in the nightstand drawer. His phone was still plugged into the charger by the bed screen dark. I stood there with my hand on the doorknob, listening to the silence press in around me. The cabin had a way of holding sound, the hum of the fridge, the soft click of the heater, but that morning it felt hollow, as if the walls were absorbing every noise before it could form. I walked softly across the floor, my shoes whispering against the boards. Nothing was out of place. Nothing was broken. Nothing suggested fear or distress. But everything suggested he hadn't intended to be gone long. I stepped back outside and let the cold air fill my lungs. I looked toward the road, half expecting to see him walking up the lane, a day pack slung over his shoulder, maybe waving awkwardly as if apologizing for the worry. But the road was empty. A raven croaked from a high branch, its wings flashing dark against the pale sky. I called the sheriff's office just after 1. My voice shook slightly and I tried to hide it. The dispatcher told me someone would come by. When the deputy arrived, a man with weather-creased skin and a calm, level tone. The sun had already dipped behind the ridge, leaving a colorless light across the property. We walked through the cabin together, his boots heavy on the floor. He listened to my account, nodding slowly, his breath steady and unfazed. "It happens," he said gently. "People take off for a day or two. Sometimes they forget to tell anyone." I wanted to believe that, truly, but my gut kept twisting. The deputy stepped outside and scanned the property, his silhouette framed by the dimming sky. "Let's give it until morning," he said finally. "If he doesn't show up, we'll take the next steps." He drove off with a low rumble, leaving a faint smell of exhaust in the cool air. I stood on the porch as the last traces of light drained from the trees. The shadows pooled between the trunks, and the first chirps of night insects began rising like soft static along the hillside. I remember the exact moment the dread settled in for good. It was when I turned to lock the cabin door behind me and realized the porch light had flickered on automatically. The glow spilled out onto the empty steps, shining over a space where no one stood. A light waiting for someone who wasn't coming home. By the time I reached my house again, the sky had turned a deep indigo and a single pair of headlights was creeping up my driveway. A sheriff's cruiser, moving slow, deliberate. Its engine idled low as it came to a stop, and the deputy stepped out, removing his hat with a quiet, heavy sort of courtesy. That's when I knew before he even spoke that the night was about to change. I remember the morning the search truly began because the light looked different, thinner somehow, as if the sun itself were hesitating. I'd been awake since before dawn, sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had long gone cold, listening to the low rumble of a cruiser idling at the foot of my hill. The deputy from the night before had returned with 2 others, their radios crackling softly in the pre-dawn stillness. When I stepped outside, the chill hit me immediately, that crisp, early spring bite that seeps through your sleeves no matter how warm you think you are. The deputies stood in a quiet semicircle at the cabin's steps, hats pulled low steam lifting from their thermoses as they laid out the plan in low, steady voices. And that was the moment it sank in. This wasn't just a late return or a missed checkout. This was now an official search, a missing person case. Bigger than me, bigger than my property, bigger than whatever small, hopeful explanations I'd clung to through the long, uneasy night. When Detective Mark Delaney arrived, his SUV rolled up slow, crunching the gravel with a sound that carried all the way up the slope. I'd met him once years earlier at a town meeting, a tall, broad-shouldered man with the kind of calm presence that can silence a room without effort. He greeted me gently, as if afraid to add to the weight already pressing against my chest. The frost still clung to the edges of the porch boards as he walked through the cabin again, his boots leaving damp prints on the floor, his breath faint in the cold air. Outside, 2 more cruisers and a ranger truck eased into place, their lights flicking briefly across the trees before shutting off, leaving behind only the steady hum of engines and the soft metallic ticking as they cooled. Within an hour, maps were spread across the hood of a truck held down by radios and gloves. I watched as gloved fingers traced the back roads and the trail systems, marking points with a green grease pencil. They spoke in terms of grids, ranges miles between landmarks. The rangers carried laminated sheets showing terrain features, steep sections, gullies, seasonal streams swollen with meltwater. Volunteers began arriving 1 or 2 at a time, bundled in jackets and gaiters, the smell of wet wool hanging around them. Some were locals who knew the woods like a second language. Others were hikers passing through who overheard the radio call on their scanners and came without hesitation. The quiet of earlier days had vanished, replaced by a steady pulse of human movement, all of it purposeful yet strangely subdued. Around mid-morning, the first team set out. I walked with them as far as the bend in the lane, my coat pulled tight, the cold stinging my cheeks. Their boots sank into the soft earth, leaving crisp impressions that looked almost too sharp against the muddy ground. Dogs barked in short, eager bursts, their handlers kneeling to let them sniff the air before giving them the command. The forest swallowed them quickly, bright jackets and reflective strips disappearing behind the first stand of pines until only the faint rustle of branches marked their passing. The plan was simple at first start with the nearest trail systems, especially the one I'd recommended. The Sunset Ridge routes were well known, often crowded later in the season, but on a cold April weekday, they were almost empty. When the team reached the parking area, they found only a few scattered tire tracks left by old visitors, and the usual signs of weather puddles grit a thin frosting of pine pollen. Not a single print matched the tread of Aaron's rental car tires. The Rangers split up. Some followed the trail loop, calling his name into the vast quiet. Others checked the restrooms, the picnic area, the overflow lot, where snow sometimes drifted waist-deep in winter. Every radioed update came back the same nothing. As the hours passed, I found myself drifting between the property and the staging area at the edge of the woods, unable to settle in either place. My house felt too still, as if the walls themselves were listening. The cabin felt even worse, tidy, undisturbed, and far too empty. Each time I stepped inside, I found myself noticing little details I hadn't registered before: the slight tilt of his folded map on the counter, the way one sleeve of his jacket brushed the back of a chair, the faint smell of his shampoo lingering in the bathroom. It felt intrusive to stand there, but it felt heartless to stay away. Every part of the cabin seemed suspended in the moment he walked out the door. By mid-afternoon, a low-flying helicopter began circling over the ridge, its blades chopping the air into heavy pulses you could feel in your chest. The sound bounced off the valley walls, echoing through the trees like a heartbeat out of rhythm. The pilot hovered, scanning for anything: a splash of color, a movement that didn't match the sway of branches, a sign someone was lying injured below the canopy. The wind from the rotors kicked up loose needles and grit around the cabin, stinging my skin and filling my mouth with the taste of dust. Still nothing. A ranger returned around 4 with what he thought might be a lead, a faint track off a side trail, a place where the mud looked disturbed. The marking sticks went up. Photos were taken, but the impression was too wide, too soft, too eroded from the rain to belong to a single person. More likely a deer, one ranger said gently, or maybe an old boot print washed half away by yesterday's storm. Whatever it was, it brought no answers. The sun dipped behind the ridge as they marked it inconclusive, and the cold settled in behind it. The next morning the operation grew. More volunteers arrived from nearby towns, some carrying thermoses of coffee that smelled rich and bitter in the cold air, others with packs full of first aid supplies or extra radios. Maps were updated, new grid lines drawn. I watched as the rangers briefed them, their voices calm but urgent, the frost from their breath rising in pale bursts as they talked. The dogs were restless tails wagging noses to the ground. Everyone moved with quiet purpose, but the tension was unmistakable, humming in the spaces between words. They expanded the search radius to 5 miles from the cabin, combing old logging roads that snaked through the backcountry. Those roads are tricky. They can look solid but hide deep ruts beneath soft earth, or be blocked by fallen limbs hidden under leaves. I walked one stretch with a pair of volunteers until the mud sucked at our boots, smelling of rot and cold minerals. They called his name in intervals, their voices fading deeper into the trees, swallowed by the vastness of it all. We found empty shotgun shells at one old campsite, rusted and half buried. A broken camp chair left behind from who knows how long ago. a soda can blown dry and brittle by seasons of freeze and thaw, little history lessons of people who'd come and gone. None of it belonged to the man we were looking for. Each time the radios crackled, my stomach tightened. Most calls were routine Grid 7 clear, switching to the ravine. Dogs picking up animal scent. One moment, though, sent a ripple through all of us, a possible scent trail near a stream bed. For a few minutes, everyone seemed to hold the same breath, watching the handlers work, listening to the dogs' sharp barks. But as the team pushed upstream, the signal faded. A gust of wind shifted. The dog circled confused, then sat tail low. The handler whispered something only he could hear and gently scratched its ears, another lead dissolving into nothing. Back in town, rumors had already begun circulating the way they always do when fear creeps into a place that's usually quiet. Some folks at the general store whispered that hikers get turned around all the time, especially those from out of state who don't understand the terrain. Others muttered about the steep weather swings this time of year, the sudden cold snaps that can disorient even seasoned locals. A few leaned on the idea of a wild animal encounter, though the rangers dismissed that almost immediately. The truth was, no one knew anything. Every explanation sounded thin. Every theory seemed to crumble as soon as it left someone's mouth. One older man, someone who'd lived here his whole life, pulled me aside after hearing what was happening. He talked in a low voice, smelling faintly of sawdust and pipe smoke, about another disappearance decades earlier in the White Mountains, a young researcher who'd gone out and never come back. He said the woods have places that don't give people up easily. I didn't know then that Aaron had researched that very case, that he'd spent months studying old maps and coordinates on his computer. But something about the way this man spoke slow, certain as though repeating an old truth, made my skin prickle. Fatigue settled in by the third day. Everyone moved a little slower, shoulders hunched against the cold eyes shadowed from lack of sleep. The rangers' radios were always on, emitting soft bursts of static, little chirps that made me jump more than once. The smell of campfire smoke drifted through the staging area where volunteers gathered to warm their hands over a metal barrel. People spoke quietly, as if afraid to disturb something unseen. The forest, which usually felt so familiar to me, had taken on a heavier presence, pressing in around us like a closed fist. At one point, I walked behind the cabin alone, following a narrow footpath that wound between hemlocks. The air back there was colder, damper, the ground softer under my boots. A woodpecker knocked rhythmically somewhere high above me, the sound echoing through the branches. For a brief moment, I let myself imagine that maybe I'd spot him emerging from between the trees, tired and embarrassed, offering some simple explanation that would allow all of us to exhale again. But all I saw were shadows shifting in the breeze like dark water rippling between trunks. When I returned to the front of the property, a ranger was kneeling beside his truck, marking something on the map with a blue marker. The color stood out sharply against the faded paper. His brow was furrowed, his movements careful, almost hesitant. He didn't look up at first, not until he capped the marker and exhaled through his nose in a way that made the hair on my arms rise. Then a voice crackled over the radio, short, urgent, impossible to ignore. "Command, we've got something you'll want to see." All movement seemed to pause. A deputy straightened, shielding his eyes against the afternoon glare. The ranger folded the map, his hands suddenly still, and I felt it, the subtle shift in the air, like the woods themselves were bracing for what came next. I didn't know what they'd found. Not yet. But I knew deep in my chest that whatever it was would change everything. I knew something had shifted the moment the radio changed tone. Up until then, the search had moved in its steady rhythm. Voices rising and falling, footsteps crunching across thawing ground, dogs barking in short bursts as teams pushed deeper into the backcountry. But then, late in the afternoon, a sharp crackle cut through the usual static. A ranger's voice came through tight and clipped, the kind that makes everyone within earshot go still. The deputies near me stopped mid-sentence. One of them lifted the radio closer to his ear, his jaw tensing as he listened. A few seconds later, he looked over at me with a kind of quiet gravity that made my stomach drop long before I knew what he'd heard. The convoy formed quickly, 3 trucks, a ranger's ATV, and 2 deputies who didn't say a word as they pulled on heavier coats and checked the batteries on their radios. Detective Delaney walked with purpose, not fast, but with a weight that made each step feel decisive. The wind picked up as we headed down an old logging road carrying the scent of wet leaves and cold stone. The forest around us had fallen into a deep kind of hush, as if it understood before any of us did. My boots slipped once on the soft mud, and one of the volunteers steadied me with a hand on my elbow. His glove was cold, lightly dusted with pine duff. The team slowed when we reached a fork where the old road narrowed into a rutted path. Yellow ribbons were tied to low branches, fluttering faintly in the breeze. A ranger motioned for the group to stop. Beyond him, farther down the slope, I could see 2 more figures standing close to a cluster of pines. One of them had a hand raised as if asking the woods themselves for silence. The air smelled of damp bark and something older earth turned up by boots, maybe, or the faint musk of a hidden animal trail. When we approached, the ranger who had radioed earlier stepped forward. His face wasn't alarmed, just somber, as though he were trying to place his words carefully. He spoke quietly to Delaney, his breath visible in the cold air. I couldn't hear what he said, but I saw the detective's expression tighten in a way that told me this wasn't nothing. This wasn't a false lead or an abandoned campsite from someone long gone. Something was here. They led us a few yards farther, where the forest opened just enough to see sunlight slanting through the branches, making thin golden stripes on the ground. And there, hanging on a low pine limb, as if someone had paused mid-journey and left it behind, was a black fleece jacket. It swayed gently, the breeze pushing it in and out of the light. Pine needles clung to its shoulders. The fabric looked weathered, almost stiff from months of cold and rain, but it was unmistakable. My legs went weak. Not dramatically, not all at once, just an immediate looseness like the strength had been drained out of them. I reached for a tree trunk to steady myself. The bark felt cold and rough under my palm, grounding me in a moment that felt too unreal to bear. For a few seconds, the sound around me muted, replaced only by the rapid thump of my pulse in my ears. Delaney stepped closer to the jacket, his boots sinking slightly into the soft forest floor. He didn't touch it at first, just studied how it hung, the way the sleeves drooped as if weighted by time. A deputy took photos, his camera shutter clicking quietly in the tense air. When they finally lifted the jacket down, bits of debris rained lightly onto the moss below, small flakes of bark dust, a few fragile needles. A ranger reached carefully into the left pocket. The woods felt motionless as he pulled out a folded piece of lined paper, the edges warped from moisture. Even from where I stood, I could see the pale blue of the notebook lines. He opened it slowly. A breeze caught the corner and fluttered it like a fragile wing. The ranger's eyes moved over the writing, and a stillness settled across his face, something between disbelief and sorrow. He handed the note to Delaney, whose expression shifted once more, tightening by a fraction. I knew even before they said it aloud that the writing inside belonged to the man who had arrived at my cabin with a tired smile and a soft voice just days before he vanished. The detective held the paper gently as if it might crumble between his fingers. I couldn't breathe. The cold seemed to press deeper into my chest, wrapping tight around my ribs. A volunteer pointed quietly at the ground beneath the branch, noticing the faint disturbance in the soil, but it didn't matter, there was no one here now. Just the jacket, and the note, and the knowledge that we were finally seeing something he'd left behind with intention. When Delaney approached me, he spoke softly, as though volume alone might shatter what little steadiness I still had. He told me what the note contained, numbers marking a location deeper into the wilderness, a date from the morning Aaron disappeared, and a single line that carried a weight I still feel in my bones. I won't repeat the words exactly here, not yet, but they struck me in a way that hollowed out the space behind my ribs. It was a message left by someone very much alive at the time he wrote it, someone walking farther into the woods than anyone expected. The rest of that afternoon moved in slow motion. The team cataloged the jacket and sealed the note in a clear evidence bag. A few deputies formed a perimeter marking off the area with tape that fluttered weakly in the rising wind. More photos were taken close-ups of the branch, the stitching on the sleeve, the way the fabric had faded unevenly under the elements. I watched them work from a few yards away, my arms wrapped tightly around myself, the cold seeping in through my coat. A numbness settled over me, not denial, not shock exactly, just a deep, quiet ache that made it hard to stay upright. When they finished, Delaney looked toward the direction the coordinates pointed. It was a stretch of wild country. Few people ventured into a dense mix of underbrush and forgotten logging paths. The forest there was older, darker, less forgiving. The kind of place where a person could disappear without leaving much behind. Later that evening, after we returned to the staging area, the forensic team ran their initial checks. They confirmed the jacket was indeed his. The DNA on the collar matched. The handwriting on the note was consistent with samples from his apartment. The date he'd written down matched the morning he left my cabin with that small day pack and a map folded neatly in his hand. In the back of my mind, I had hoped, maybe foolishly, that wherever he was, he had simply lost track of time or changed plans or wandered somewhere with the intention of returning. But now the truth had taken shape in front of me, as solid and immovable as the mountains around us. He had walked farther into the wilderness by choice, and he had left this clue behind for someone to find, though why or for whom none of us yet understood. The moment the forensic team sealed the evidence containers, an odd hush settled over the group. Even the dogs grew quiet, their tails low, their movements subdued. The light was fading fast, slipping behind the tree line in streaks of pale gold and deep blue. A ranger lit a lantern, its warm glow flickering across the map laid out on a truck hood. The coordinates from the note were entered into a GPS unit. The path they plotted was long, winding, and treacherous. As the lantern's light trembled in the cool wind, I felt something inside me shift, a recognition that the next part of this search would reveal more than we were ready for. That whatever lay deeper in those woods had waited a long time for someone to find it. And now, finally, we were moving toward it. The detective asked if I wanted to head home, but I couldn't. My house felt too far, too quiet, too removed from the gravity of what had been found. So I stayed near the trucks, rubbing my hands together against the evening chill, listening to the hum of the generator and the low murmur of voices planning the next day's push. Eventually, one of the deputies approached with a clipboard asking for a few more details about when I'd last seen him, what he'd been wearing, what he'd carried. His tone was gentle, but the questions felt heavier now, colored by the knowledge of that jacket hanging alone in the woods. I answered as best I could, my voice sounding distant and thin in my own ears. Long after dark, I found myself sitting at the edge of the staging area on a fallen log, staring at the faint outline of mountains against a moonlit sky. The air smelled faintly of damp moss and the lingering trace of exhaust. Someone handed me a cup of coffee that had gone lukewarm, but I held it anyway, letting the warmth seep into my palms. The forest around us was still except for the occasional rustle of unseen animals moving through underbrush. Then Delaney stepped away from the group, speaking quietly into his phone. I couldn't hear his words, but the way he held his shoulders told me he was delivering the news no family ever wants to receive. The Blake family would begin making arrangements to come to Vermont. The thought sank into me like a stone sliding into deep water. When the detective finally hung up and returned to the table where the maps lay, he looked older somehow, more weighed down than he had that morning. He made a few notes, circled tomorrow's search zones, then exhaled slowly, the breath visible in the cold air. A few minutes later, someone flipped on a portable floodlight, washing the staging area in harsh white. The shadows it cast were long and uneasy, stretching across the ground like something reaching. And that's where we left it for the night, on the edge of something we hadn't yet named, with the forest holding tight to whatever waited in the dark beyond those coordinates. The night after, they found the jacket settled over the hills in a way I'll never forget. The search site quieted slowly like a machine powering down, and the cold sharpened as people drifted back to their vehicles. A lantern flickered on a tailgate while deputies packed evidence kits, their gloved hands moving with steady, practiced care. I stood off to the side near a maple trunk slick with evening frost, trying to swallow the hard truth that had been placed in front of us. The jacket, the note, the handwritten coordinates, those things changed the search from hopeful to something heavier, something final. Detective Delaney kept his voice low when he asked if I wanted to go home for the night. I shook my head. I didn't trust my house or its silence or the way the dark rooms would make my thoughts louder. So I stayed close to the staging area until the last generator was shut off, and only the stars remained, cold pinpoints of light scattered across the Vermont sky. The forest felt different now, no longer indifferent, but watchful, as if it had been listening to every word exchanged under those floodlights. The next morning, the Blake family arrived from Connecticut. I heard their car before I saw it, tires crunching over the frost-stiff gravel, the engine pulling up beside the line of cruisers. When Aaron's parents stepped out, wrapped in coats too light for the mountain cold, their exhaustion showed in every movement. His mother held a thermos in both hands, as if needing its warmth to stay upright. His father's shoulders were squared in a way that tried to be strong but didn't quite reach his eyes. Their daughter, a few steps behind, looked up at the forest with a mixture of fear and determination, as though she were staring down something ancient. Delaney explained the discovery, his words careful, each one chosen with the gentleness of a man who's had to give news like this more times than he'd ever wanted. The family listened in stillness. No tears right away, no outburst, just a long, quiet settling of grief around them, like a heavy winter coat. When Delaney showed them the evidence bag containing the note, Aaron's mother reached out, her fingers trembling lightly against the plastic. She didn't open it, just rested her hand there for a moment, eyes dimmed with a kind of pain that didn't need sound to be understood. After that, the search shifted north. The coordinates written on the note led deeper into the forest, 8 miles farther through terrain so dense and uneven the teams had to mark trees with ribbons every few yards just to avoid looping back. I didn't go with them that day. The detective asked me to stay at the staging point, partly for my sake, partly so they could reach me quickly if needed. The hours that followed were long and cold. The air smelled of wood smoke from a volunteer's small fire, and the metallic tang of the generator powering the radios. Every crackle, every burst of static made my breath catch. When the second note was found weeks later, tucked under a small cairn beside a remote stream crossing, it came as both a shock and a confirmation. None of us had expected anything else to surface, especially not something hidden with such care. The torn piece of paper held a second set of coordinates and a name. Not his own, but that of a man who vanished decades earlier in another state. The handwriting, though shakier than the first note, bore the same patterns, the same slant, the same careful spacing. Law enforcement treated the discovery with the gravity it deserved. Federal agencies briefly stepped in to help coordinate with authorities across the border because the new location straddled the Vermont-Quebec line. But winter came early that year, laying down a crust of ice that made the region impassable. Plans would have to wait. And as the snow deepened, hope thinned in ways I don't think any of us were prepared for. By January, the Blake family held a memorial service. They invited me, though I didn't feel I had the right to attend. But they insisted, saying I was the last person who saw their son's face before he stepped into the trees. The service took place on a cold Sunday morning in their hometown church where the stained glass windows glowed with soft winter light. There was no casket, only photographs, one of Aaron at a family barbecue, another of him at a beach, somewhere warm, smiling in a way I never saw during his brief stay at my cabin. His mother read a short statement, her voice steady even as her hands gripped the sides of the podium. She said she hoped he'd found peace wherever his steps had taken him. That was the line that stayed with me. The case remained officially open even after the second search in spring turned up nothing at the northern coordinates. Volunteers followed the GPS point, exactly moving through dense thickets where the air smelled of thawing moss and old pine resin. They found no shelter, no remains, no evidence of anyone ever camping there. Just forest, endless, unruly, indifferent. When they returned, boots caked with mud and shoulders slumped with fatigue, I saw the answer in their eyes. Whatever story Aaron had been following, it didn't end neatly. In the weeks that followed, life around the town returned to its quiet rhythms. But something had shifted. People kept their voices lower when they spoke of the wilderness. Hikers checked in with friends before heading out, even on short trails. And the cabin, my cabin, sat empty more often than I'd expected. Maybe word had traveled, or maybe the silence of the place carried its own memory of what had happened. I cleaned it anyway, wiping down the windows, shaking out the blankets, lighting a small fire in the stove just to hear the crackle of wood. But at night, when the wind pressed against the roof and the pines groaned softly, a weight settled behind my ribs that hadn't been there before. Detective Delaney retired not long after the final search effort. I saw him at the general store on his last week, standing in line with a half-gallon of milk and a small bag of ice. He looked tired, though not defeated, just worn down by years of carrying other people's pain. We talked outside for a moment, our breaths fogging in the crisp air. He told me he kept the file on his desk longer than he was required to, not because he expected new leads, but because something about the case didn't let go easily. "Some stories don't close," he said quietly, looking toward the hills. "They just settle into the cracks." I think that was the moment I realized how deeply this had etched itself into me. Not like a wound that bleeds, but like one that stiffens the skin around it. I found myself avoiding the particular stretch of woods where the jacket was discovered. Even now, years later, I can feel the cold air from that day whenever I drive past the old access road, the way it seeped through my coat, the way the light caught on the faded fabric, the way my heartbeat thudded in my ears. The cabin still stands. I still rent it. But I walk its floors differently now, aware of the small echoes left behind by a man who stayed there for one quiet night before walking into a mystery that none of us could untangle. Sometimes when I straighten the quilt or wipe down the counter, I think of him studying his map by the window or tying his boots at the foot of the bed. Ordinary actions that in hindsight feel loaded with a meaning I'll never understand. And on certain evenings when the sun drops behind the ridge and the woods darken in that soft, familiar way, I stand on my porch and let the quiet rise around me. The wind stirs the trees. A dog barks somewhere down the valley. And for a moment, I feel the presence of all the people who've passed through these hills, some who returned, and some who didn't. The last thing I see in my mind, more often than I expect, is that jacket hanging from the pine branch, swaying lightly in the cold mountain air. A quiet sign left behind by someone searching for something none of us could name. It's an image that settles into the silence and stays. If you're still here with me, let me know where you're listening from and follow the channel so these stories are never forgotten.